What masterpiece are we dissecting?
Extreme coda.
There was a moment in the 1980s in Great Britain when horror films became a moral panic like never before. 72 films were banned for being too violent or too upsetting in their content. These became known as the video nasties, a uniquely British phenomenon that is the backdrop of Prano Bailey Bond's upcoming film Censor. To combat the possible repercussions of too much horror, somewhere in a dimly lit basement in London, there's a group of people who watch horror film after horror film, trying to find that moment that might just be too much for audiences to handle.
There's a sequence in it where a man eats someone's face.
Oh, yes.
Yes, 18. With extensive cuts.
There's a huge responsibility placed on them. Let something through, and there might be dire consequences. What if a fictional horror inspires a real-life one? What if you see something that is just too much to bear?
So they're blaming us.
Well, there's the thing. This journalist seemed to know that it was you two who passed the film.
How the hell do they know that?
I can't believe you two let it get past you.
It's complete hysteria. It's no worse than other material we've passed.
The press are going to town.
One of these censors charged with policing horror films is our protagonist Enid Baines, and she is the beating heart of Censor, a film so layered with beauty, horror, and mystery that it deserves its very own podcast. So we just had to make it. Welcome to Censor This, a mini-series dedicated to dissecting some of the many layers of the film. My name is Anna Bogutskaya. I'm the co-founder of the horror film collective The Final Girls, and throughout the next 4 episodes, I'll be talking to film critics, cinephiles, horror experts, as well as the people who made the film to try to unpick why Censor has stuck with me and all of us just so very much. Now, for anyone who's not seen the film yet, you do not need to have seen Censor to be able to listen to this podcast. In fact, I hope that some people who haven't seen the film yet might listen to this and be encouraged to seek it out. But please be warned, there is conversation about what happens in the film, but do not worry, in this episode specifically, there is no mention about the ending or any key plot information. In the last episode, we dived deep into the psychology of Enid, and now it's time for us to unpack what exactly were the video nasties and what they meant for horror film culture then and now. To help me with this, I'm joined by the producer and host of the Evolution of Horror podcast, Mike Munzer.
Produce the Evolution of Horror podcast, which kind of looks, as the title suggests, it kind of looks at the history and the evolution of the genre. So similar to the Final Girls podcast, we take different themes, different seasons, different subgenres, and we look at them in depth and we discuss different movies, but kind of in the context of that subgenre and the way in which it changes based on what's changed in history, I suppose, and sort of track the evolution of the genre based on what's happening in the world, I suppose.
So really, you're kind of the perfect person to talk about video nasties in the context of horror films that's portrayed in Censor.
Oh God, no pressure, Anna. But yeah, in theory.
So, I mean, in this episode, we're going to be discussing specifically the context of video nasties that appears and that has generated so much interest, especially I think for audiences outside of the UK. And video nasties and that whole era in the 80s really make up the backdrop of Censor. So to start our chat, Mike, can you tell me what a video nasty is for someone who hasn't heard of the term before?
Yeah, so it's essentially a film that was kind of classified in this category. Video nasties was something that that happened in the early 80s, basically, with the dawn of home video, essentially. It was really this new unregulated medium that movies were suddenly being put on VHS and released into the world, and they weren't actually going through any kind of process of classification or censorship like cinema releases were. So it meant that anybody could make any film they want, slap any old gratuitous image on the front cover, and sell it in like a local newsagent's or convenience store or something. And that's what started to happen. And suddenly, kids and families were, witnessing or getting access to all kinds of crazy films that were just there available on shelves. And parents were able to buy whatever, adult material they wanted. And it meant that it was in the home. And therefore, there was this sudden worry that kids could access all of these terrifying, obscene movies and it would damage them irreparably and all this. And so it was this huge kind of moral panic, I suppose. And it was, I think, a perfect storm of sort of the beginning of Thatcher's Britain, this very, very conservative era in the UK that was starting to happen in the late 70s and early 80s. The birth of this new medium, VHS, which meant that films were accessible to families. And along with that, this sudden surge of cheap horror films or exploitation films that were being made because of this new medium to kind of take advantage of it, because it meant that they could easily distribute it without it going into cinemas. So all of these things happened around the same sort of time. And conservative people like Mary Whitehouse just lost their minds, absolutely lost their minds, and they thought this was the end of civilization as they knew it.
And I'll ask you about Mary Whitehouse in a second, but where was horror culture at the time? What was the sort of films that were being made in the 80s that caused so much uproar in Britain at the time that they had to be banned?
Well, gory ones, really, I suppose. Like, this is, I think for so many horror fans, a kind of golden era of horror as well. And that's because we were getting so many interesting, actually really artistically made horror movies with incredible practical effects. There was obviously the huge success of movies like Halloween in the late 70s, but also George Romero's Dawn of the Dead and that kind of thing. And in the early 80s, you saw people like Tom Savini and Rick Baker, these incredible sort of makeup effects artists and practical effects artists come to the fore. And we were getting this rush of incredible movies, the upper echelon of which were movies like The Thing, An American Werewolf in London, these movies with incredible kind of body horror and practical effects. And then there were sort of cheaper indie movies as well. You got your run of slashers, the Friday the 13th movies, The Burning, all of that kind of thing. Also had lots of blood and gore effect. Over in Italy, we were getting movies from Lucio Fulci and, Dario Argento, these super gory zombie movies and cannibal movies and that kind of thing. So they were all different, but I would say that the trend of horror movies, particularly in the early 80s, they were filled with lots of quite gratuitous but really cool gore and body horror. And that was what really, I think, offended a lot of people.
I mean, all of that sounds absolutely delightful to me, so
I know, right? These are literally my favourite films.
I know. But can you talk a little bit about kind of what was the moral panic? Like, what did people think was going to happen if anybody picked up a VHS of The Evil Dead or a Lucio Fulci film?
I think that people thought that they would, I don't know, become a serial killer? Become a cannibal? I've got no idea. It's ridiculous, isn't it? It doesn't really make any sense, but there is this, and it still exists to this day, Like, I remember news articles in the last few years about people blaming movies like, or, stories like The Slender Man on murders, right? And that kind of thing. It still is happening, this idea of blaming cinema on crimes that people commit. And I think that there was this worry that somehow young people or impressionable people were going to watch a movie like, I don't know, I Spit on Your Grave maybe, or something like that, and and want to go out and commit these crimes or do these unspeakable things to people. So I think they thought that it was in some way going to, damage people's brains or whatever, which is ridiculous. But, it's always been there, hasn't it? There was the James Bulger murder that was blamed on a Chucky movie, in the early 90s. It's always been something that's happened throughout history, and this was a real sort of concentrated era of that.
I mean, that blaming any element of pop culture, and it's usually what's considered kind of the lowest brow of pop culture, isn't it? People would blame comic books in the 1950s for creating immoral behavior or violence amongst children and young people. Then they'd blame horror movies, then they blame video games, then they blame TV series.
And there's a real element of classism to it as well, because it's I think that people like the BBFC or Mary Whitehouse, I think they trust a certain demographic of people to watch these films. But the BBFC chief censor, James Furman, actually said, it's all right for middle-class cineasts to see films like this, but what would happen if a factory worker in Manchester happened to see it? And he's talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre there. So absolute kind of blatant kind of classism there and prejudice of this idea that there are certain groups of people, that are not ready to see movies like this, or that will be damaged by movies like this, So yeah, it's all a load of rubbish, isn't it?
I mean, the times have really changed, and the BBFC, the British Board for Film Classification, has really changed. And I actually spoke to Sarah Peacock, who's the BBFC's Education and Compliance Manager, to give me a little bit more information and insight into what was happening at that time and how that's evolved now and what it actually does now. Because I understand that Prano Bailey-Bond, the director of Censor, really went into the archives of the BBFC to really understand how censors operated at the time and what it meant for them to be looking at all these films and picking out which bits to cut and why and how they picked which bits to cut from the films. Censor has really created this whole interest around the world, well, everywhere that people have been able to see it and where it's been released, into the work of, what used to be the censors in the 80s. Can you talk a little bit about how it's different now from how it was in that time?
Yeah, so it is a bit of a strange experience when we were sort of watching the film and rating the film, because on the one hand we could relate to sort of the process that Enid and her colleagues were going through, in the sense that they were watching a film together, they were typing on typewriters their notes and stuff, but essentially watching it, writing up reports of some kind and discussing it and then coming to a decision. So that process has very much stayed the same since the 1980s, but what is fundamentally quite different is obviously sort of the attitudes towards censorship and to cutting material. So very much now, in the 1980s, the BBFC changed its name from the British Board of Film Censor to the British Board of Film Classification. And, we very much feel that it's adults' right. Adults should be free to choose their own entertainment. We're very much here to sort of support and empower people, particularly families with younger children, to choose content that suits their family. Everyone at the BBFC loves film and cinema, and we want people to have as positive a viewing experience as possible. So I think sort of definitely a shift in terms of there's a line in the film in Censor where it says, "If in doubt, just cut it." And I think that's very not what we don't say that anymore at the BBFC. Not that the BBFC is the regulatory body in Censor, but that's very not the how it works now.
And do you have a sense of kind of what guiding principles motivated the work?
Well, I think in the film, they talk a lot about this idea of harm and causing harm to the public. So the idea of harm is kind of like fundamental to the BBFC, particularly in the context of the Video Nasties era. And I think this is kind of one of the real sort of shifting attitudes and sort of shifting areas from the regulatory body that's presented in Censor and perhaps the BBFC today. So we absolutely have to take into account harm, and if a film is likely to cause a credible harm risk to society, to vulnerable viewers. That's kind of outlined in this piece of legislation called the Video Recordings Act, that was set up in 1984, kind of in response to the Video Nasties. So absolutely guiding principle for the BBFC, but I think attitudes towards media effects has definitely shifted since the 1980s. And as I say, while it is still an issue that we have to take into account, it's really, really rare for us now to intervene at the adult level, so at 18, on the grounds of harm. If we do that, it's typically in relation, unfortunately, to depictions of sexual violence on screen, or potentially in regards to depictions of discrimination and hate on screen. But as I say, it's really, really rare for us to do that now.
You've mentioned her a bunch of times. Can you elaborate a little bit on who Mary Whitehouse was?
Yeah, she was. I mean, she's kind of like the boogeyman for horror fans, isn't she? Mary Whitehouse. She's this like mythic person. Essentially, kind of, I know of her from just reading about this era, watching documentaries about this era. She was essentially just a sort of a conservative activist, wasn't she? And she was really kind of, she became a real public figure around this time, for basically really going hard on any kind of sort of counterculture movement or anything that would be in any way kind of boundary pushing or went against very, very conservative Christian norms, I suppose. She kind of became the spokesperson for how outrageous and how disgusting, whatever it might be, punk music, rock music, horror movies, exploitation movies, anything you like that doesn't kind of that doesn't conform to that kind of Christian conservative norm. Mary Whitehouse was on TV leading some kind of crusade against it most of the time. She even had a massive problem with Doctor Who in the early 70s, this kids' TV show that she thought was kind of evil and that kind of thing, and really kind of spoke out and wrote a lot about it as well. So she was the figurehead for this kind of, this kind of older conservative group that were terrified of movies that were happening at this point, and really kind of did everything she could to get them pulled and get them banned.
And she even, didn't she do some sort of presentation or talk or report in front of the MPs or the House of Commons, where she edited together, maybe not herself personally, but showcase clips from all these horror films from the early 80s to showcase just how depraved they were.
Yeah. And I love that idea of her showing this like show reel of gory horror from the early 80s. That's amazing.
Kind of legendary behavior, I'm not gonna lie. It does seem quite a fun. Here's why the Evil Dead is absolutely going to turn you into a serial killer.
I love it. It's absolutely bonkers, isn't it? It's absolutely bonkers. I love it. But she was really committed. That is one thing you can say about her. She was very committed.
And what do you think the Video Nasties era meant for horror fans, for horror film culture?
Well, this is what's really interesting, and I guess the kind of irony about it in a way is that, there was this list of movies, 72 movies, 39 of which were actually sort of prosecuted movies, right? Where it was actually you could be charged with a criminal offense for kind of selling these movies and that kind of thing. But what happened was these movies became like the holy grails for horror fans, right? Like all that happened was some of these movies were actually, some of them are classics, some of them weren't even very good, but because they were categorized as these video nasties, it suddenly became like you really wanted to see them, and they were almost elevated to this new exciting kind of echelon of horror. Because of course, I mean, I wasn't around at this time, but even since, I've done my best to try and track down a load of those movies on that video nasty list, because you want to see, don't you, what is it that's angered people about them. You want to see some of these gory, shocking moments that you read about. So yeah, I think it actually, what it did was, in some ways, it did the opposite to what they were hoping. It didn't kind of suppress the movies. It made them even more enticing. And I think horror fans, really kind of obviously wanted to support a lot of the movies on these lists and wanted to seek them out and wanted to get their hands on them.
So on that note, actually, in my interview with Ruth Peace, the makeup and hair designer for Censor, she actually was a teenager during the era of the video nasty. So she spoke a little bit about how she watched these films with her friends and what it was like to be a horror fan in the 80s when all of this stuff was happening.
I mean, all I did was watch horror films. I think, that could have been like a real waste of time growing up, but actually it seems to have really paid off. The first one that kind of really stuck with me was Evil Dead. And it was one of those things growing up in the UK and the video nasty era. Just that whole experience of being a kid and being told like there are all these amazing films, you're going to love them, but you can't see any of them. It just became like this treasure trove. So finally seeing, well, I think the first cuts I saw of Evil Dead were probably, I remember there were so many things that didn't make sense because so much was cut out of it. But just the whole atmosphere and feeling of that film, I think that was probably the one that really made me want to kind of do that as a job and be within that world, which is super naive because if you read about the hell they went through making that film, like how tough it was. And in my mind, I was like, oh, great, how wonderful. They went out to a cabin and they just shot it and they just did it. That's so great. But yeah, absolutely loved that film.
And did you know about the video nasty era? Were you interested in that era before a Censor came along?
Yeah, it was a huge thing for me. I'm 39 now, but obviously with the UK, we had banned films until I think Texas Chainsaw came out in like 1999 or 2000 officially, where you could actually go into a shop and buy it. Which seems crazy now. I mean, like The Exorcist and all these films where you just couldn't watch them. And growing up, a huge part of my social life and my interactions was hanging out with my friends, and we'd all get together and make friends with a market seller who was selling like dodgy rip-off copies of like these terrible VHS, and you'd have to kind of befriend them, like gain their trust by buying films you didn't want to see.
Oh my God.
That were just like, yeah, it's so weird. So just kind of mainstream like thrillers or whatever that you could buy them in the stores, but you had to kind of pretend like you wanted to get this deal. And after, I don't know, like a few months of going and buying these like terrible VHS that you didn't want of other films, he would eventually like bring out this folder from underneath the desk, from underneath his stall, which was pages and pages of banned horror films. And it was like a huge thing. Like you'd gotten in there, you'd gotten into the underworld of like all of these films that you weren't supposed to see. And because you could get legitimately arrested and, your life ruined for selling films like that. So, it was a huge thing. It was like an undercover operation. And then we'd all get together and I think it was about like 20 or 25 pounds per ripped off video. And, which is, I guess was a lot.
That sounds like a lot for the 80s or the 90s.
Yeah. And they would this was kind of, I guess like mid 90s, mid to around that kind of time. And they were terrible copies as well, like absolutely, like you could barely see anything.
And I guess, there's tons of places that have the specific list of these 72 films, and they kind of go from, Little White Lies has a great list ranking all of them. It kind of goes from classics like Texas Chainsaw Massacre to Revenge of the Boogeyman or Gestapo's Last Orgy, which,
oh my God, so many Nazis. There's like SS experiment camp and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, it's so funny. Yeah, that's it. You get the whole spectrum on this list, that's for sure.
Totally, but it does give you, and horror fans, both of the time and even now, and I actually think it would be really fun for people who enjoy Censor to literally go down that list and seek them out, or at least some of them, because it's like you say, it's really interesting, and it's a to-do list to see what was so perverse and off-putting by them, what was so obscene about these movies that they had to be banned. And some of them were put on that list of 39 films, as you said, that could put you in jail.
Yeah. And, it often came down to the artwork, I think, as well. The cover art, they often had images on the front that I'm sure that there were so many of these movies that, the BBFC or whoever else didn't even bother to watch before they were pulled or labelled video nasty, Driller Killer was a really famous one, obviously, because it has that image of the man with the drill going into his head on the cover. But yeah, like some of them are super gory, quite explicit movies. Obviously, Cannibal Holocaust is still to this day quite a controversial movie because it's got real sort of animal cruelty in it and some other things. But then there are other movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which, of course, as we all know, famously, barely has any gore, barely has a drop of blood in it. There's nothing really that should lead that film to get banned in any way. And movies like Possession, which are these kind of, almost these kind of art house masterpieces, essentially, aren't they, as well? And yeah, it's such a broad spectrum of movies. Really interesting to work your way down the list and see what's on there,
And how do you think Censor showcases this particular time? And especially because our protagonist, Enid, is a film censor. We first meet her cutting out and making notes about eye gouging scenes. And, the whole film is very much about her, but her job is so much at the heart of who she is as a character, and the video nasties and this commitment to protecting the public from seeing these films is also such a big part of who she is. How do you think kind of Censor taps into this era and this fear of the horror film?
Yeah, I think Censor does an incredible job, actually, of putting you in the mindset of one of these censors, of somebody that works at a place like the BBFC, who has to sit and watch every single one of these movies, right? And what that could do to you, because we all love these movies, but we don't necessarily, for our day job, have to sit through every single movie like this in a dark room and make certain cuts or cut out stuff that's genuinely harmful and that kind of thing. And it's a really interesting kind of study of what that is like, I think. And of course, at this point in time, there was this surge of movies like this, like I said earlier, because of this kind of birth of this new medium, because of just horror trends, because of the success of movies like Friday the 13th and Halloween that were very cheap and did very well. There was this surge of slasher movies, splatter movies that people were making for cheap and distributing for cheap. So I'm sure at that point there must have been a hell of a lot of, very gory, scuzzy movies that people that worked at censorship boards had to work their way through. And there was this kind of, I guess, this push-pull aspect of, what you yourself think is acceptable versus what society is pressuring you to deem acceptable and unacceptable. Working as a censor at this point and having people looming over you like Mary Whitehouse and whoever else. And that real kind of conflict, I suppose, as to what you deem to be okay for giving a certificate and putting out there into the world, and what you think shouldn't be and everything. And I think all of those questions Censor kind of really cleverly, subtly sort of explores.
In my conversation with Niamh Algar, we actually spoke about the sort of research that she did into how censors worked at that time, and also kind of some of the motivation behind Enid's dedication to her job.
There was Carl, who Prano put me in touch with, had been a film censor around the time that Censor is set, and it was just really fascinating to hear her talk about the films like that I was familiar with, that where its scenes were like cut out or its scenes were seen as too explicit, because of it wasn't so much the violence, but so much so how women were actually being treated. You could tell how women were being treated in those scenes, and how, this was more of an exploration into the misconduct on set that you could possibly see within a film. But also it's just that she said there was so much of it where you just spend, just the idea that spending hours and hours and hours watching such explicit content, and it all comes down to this character of how perhaps that would have this effect on someone's psyche, or for me it was always trying to figure out why someone is doing the things that they do. And I just wanted to answer, me and Prana were kind of began with trying to answer, why is it that Enid does this specific job in relation to her own life, and the answer was that she's trying to protect an audience. She's trying to protect the public from seeing something that they shouldn't see, perhaps because she's seen something that she shouldn't see.
So she's almost like absorbing all of these violent imagery and this pain from everyone else to try to protect everyone else from it.
Yeah, she's filtering it. And what that's essentially what she does. She's filtering reality to make it more tangible for people to digest.
And how do you think it presents the actual the making of these horror films? So we kind of see three different aspects of horror culture at the time, don't we? We see it from the censor's point of view, from Enid's point of view, where she's thinking to herself that she's protecting the audience from harm by removing certain bits of these films. And then we see the video store, which is a really fascinating scene. And then we see the making of a horror film by this kind of mythical director, Frederick North. So what do you make about these other two aspects, the horror culture, the video store culture, and the actual making of a horror film?
Well, the video store culture is incredible, isn't it? That idea that you're buying something that's so... I don't know, it's almost like it's some sort of drug deal or something, isn't it? In a way, like the way that they have to go in and buy this kind of behind the counter stuff and keep it really subtle. Again, it's so crazy and it's so ridiculous now in 2021 to look back on that and think that's what you had to do in order to get hold of a copy of, Zombie Flesh Eaters, Lucio Fulci's Zombie or something. It's like, it's hilarious that this is what you had to do. But it's a really brilliant little snapshot. It's a really interesting insight, the kind of illicitness. There's a sort of sleaziness about it as well. But there's also something kind of really exciting about it at the same time. Again, they kind of, it's giving that impression that these video nasties were sort of mythic in some way, that they were something that really kind of special that you needed to seek out in certain places and that kind of thing. So again, with these kind of very subtle scenes, the film kind of really gets across that vibe, I think, of what it was like, I'm sure, at the time to try and seek out and try and buy or rent these movies that you weren't allowed to. And I think the thing that Censor does really cleverly in the final act, like you say, the way that it kind of shows you the side of making the movie is that it shows it through a really queasy and quite disturbing lens, right? And I think it does this very clever thing of, in some ways, it's quite balanced, because is it suggesting that there were genuinely dangerous things that went into making films? Like, were people genuinely harmed? And you get the feeling in that final act of the movie when she's actually on set and she's working with some of these scary people in the woods that, oh, maybe these movies were genuinely harmful. But then, of course, we are seeing all of this through the perspective of a censor who has these particular points of view and these particular experiences. So I think it does a really good job of putting you in the mind of what it's like to be put through all those movies as a censor. And it gives you it through this like very particular lens. It gives you a look at just how dangerous it might be to watch these movies as a censor, just how scary / potentially dangerous it was to work in a video store and distribute them, and just how potentially harmful and dangerous, especially for young women, it could have been to actually make these movies and be on the set of these movies, right? So I think it gives you a really nuanced and interesting take on all the different sides of it.
I mean, there's one of the things I love about the video store scene is the sense of fear from the shop owner. The fact that he's, either going to be prosecuted by this woman who's approaching him to ask for this banned film, but also kind of almost sweating, thinking that, is she an undercover censor? Is that a thing? Or is she a real fan and she actually wants to see this movie for whatever reason? There's this real sense of illicitness, like you say, almost like a drug deal. And I was wondering kind of, how do you think the legacy of Video Nasties has been, and kind of how is it presented through Censor, which obviously is made through a modern lens and through someone, a filmmaker who loves and knows horror really well, but is looking at such a particular point in time?
Yeah, I guess it's a very political lens, isn't it? I mean, emphasizing that feeling of Britain, a kind of a country that's in some ways known for its sort of freedoms and, prides itself on that kind of thing, almost being portrayed as, I don't know, like it's some sort of dictatorship or totalitarian society in some way. And it's not that extreme, obviously, but that idea that, this man who is just selling a film, just a fictional film that somebody has made, is sweating and panicking to the thought of being prosecuted or going to prison or being caught by an undercover cop, or being basically detected as like what could be considered an enemy of the state, right, by selling a horror film, is both ridiculous and it's nonsense, but it's also terrifying. It's a terrifying prospect. And the fact that was, even if Censor is exaggerating that somewhat, the fact that was there, that feeling in the culture and in the country at this point, that this is really genuinely something that you could go to prison for, it's terrifying, isn't it? It's a terrifying look, I suppose, at Thatcher's Britain, at what it was like back then in order to make a film or distribute a film or just watch a film.
And finally, Mike, is there anything we haven't talked about Video Nasties and that era that you really wanted to bring up?
It's just such a fascinating little era, and like we've said, it's such a fascinating list of movies, isn't it? From movies where, like I said, in some ways you can understand the outrage and the censorship to a point. There are movies like Cannibal Holocaust, which I still find incredibly troubling to watch to this day in a way. And I'm still having a conversation with people on my podcast as to, well, should they have actually released that movie without the animal cruelty? But then, should we watch it in the way that we're supposed to watch it and look at it through an objective lens, and this kind of thing? There are still conversations being had about some of these movies. And then others, the ridiculousness of it, Texas Chainsaw, Possession, and some of these others, where these are just brilliant horror films that don't have anything about them that is exploitative, that are, categorized and lumped in the same list. I think it's a fascinating little era. And it's one that we're never going to forget. And I think it's going to forever probably influence how we as a culture kind of see movies and censorship as well. And I think it's, I spoke to Prano myself, and I'm sure you've probably had a conversation with her about this, about how she finds movies like this. And I remember her telling me a story about how a Serbian film, made her, disturbed her to the point where she said, should I have watched this? Should this still, should this be allowed almost? And I think that, more than anything, this Video Nasty era is such a great way of sparking these kind of conversations, isn't it? About what should be allowed, what should be available for audiences, how far is too far, I suppose. And I think this little list is a great kind of spectrum there and a great way to kind of spark those discussions.
Finally, Mike, for anyone who's coming out of Censor and wants to explore the Video Nasty world a bit more, are there a couple of films that you would recommend for people who maybe were not aware of the Video Nasty era before, the films that are on that list, that you'd say, check these out so you can get a flavor for what it meant to be a banned film in 1980s Britain?
So many, aren't there? And I'm, some of them I've probably seen, the ones that a lot of people have heard of, but I would say definitely, if you haven't seen them, check out some of the kind of Italian ones. A Bay of Blood, Twitch of the Death Nerve by Mario Bava. That's quite an early film. That was early 70s, but that was on the list, and that's a great, especially if you're interested in the early 80s slasher movies, it's a great kind of proto-slasher film. If you think you've got the stomach for it, check out Cannibal Holocaust, because it's still shocking. It's still incredibly well made, because it looks like you're watching something you shouldn't be, right? And I think in terms of just the most fun one on the list, Lucio Fulci's Zombie Flesh Eaters. I mean, you can't go wrong with that, Anna. There's a zombie versus a shark. I mean, what more could you possibly want from a movie? It's one of the greatest movies ever made, as is, of course, Evil Dead, Possession, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and all those absolute stone cold classics that are on that list as well.
Absolutely. That's a great place to start with. Mike, thank you so much for your time. And where can people find more of your work online?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so they can find my podcast, The Evolution of Horror, at all the normal places where you find your podcasts, and you can find us on Twitter at EvolutionPod.
Thank you for listening. This podcast has been produced by the Final Girls with the support of Vertigo Releasing. It's been edited by Olivia Graham with music by Emily Levinis Farouche, used with permission. Censor is out in UK cinemas on the 20th of August, so do seek it out.